Hi class, welcome to Short Fiction. My name is Professor Lemon and I'll be making these weekly videos probably around twice a week, sometimes once if that's all I need to do. But I wanted to kind of just introduce myself first and then get into the class. First things first, you might be noticing I'm broadcasting today at home in my daughter's room because it's the only quiet room in the house right now. And so in future weeks, probably in week 3, I'll be back at the office. So you won't be able to look at these lovely decor anymore. So I apologize for that. That was sarcastic, by the way. Anyway, so let me just introduce myself. I've been teaching here for almost 5 years. I normally teach literature, like 130. I also teach creative writing as well, though. And my background is in literature and writing, as you would imagine, and that's what I got my master's in. My thesis was kind of a hybrid where it was half creative writing, half sort of research paper, kind of blending the two. And so my master's is kind of in both camps. That's why it's literature and writing. And so I also write creatively myself. I actually normally only write short fiction. Sometimes I dabble in poetry, but very infrequently. So this class is kind of right in my wheelhouse in terms of things that I not only do professionally, but just what my interests are. And so I'm really excited to teach this class and to kind of go over some of the concepts with you. And so I'm imagining that all of you have taken 130 before. So I think a lot of the things that you've learned in that class are going to help you greatly in this class. So I may from time to time reference things from 130. And if you'd like me to, I could even kind of bring in things directly if that's helpful or familiar to you, since I'm actually teaching that class currently right now. If not, I could just kind of stick to 214, which is short fiction. All right, so now that we know each other, let's talk about short fiction. So I'm going to pull up the Kurt Vonnegut essay. Well, it's not really an essay. I guess it's more of a rules for writers type thing. I want to go over a couple of these that I think are important to kind of help us kind of come to a definition of what a short story is. All right, get my notes. All right, so what is a story? So I think obviously we're all familiar with fiction. You might be more familiar with kind of television or film or novels or whatnot, what have you. But fiction, short fiction, is going to have a lot of the same elements, if not all of the same elements, of longer fiction that you're maybe used to. So what I think is useful, like about this list, is kind of looking at what is common between all types of fiction, and maybe what is specific only to short fiction, or maybe what is an important quality of short fiction, I should say too. So let's start with a couple of these and talk about them, both in general in terms of short fiction at large, and then specifically in terms of short fiction. So let's look at number 2, which is give the reader at least one character he or she can root for. So obviously this is just kind of a hallmark of all fiction to begin with, right? And so if you're thinking about any story that you've read, watched, seen, any sort of medium, that you want to be invested in at least one of the characters. And so a lot of the fiction that you see in popular culture now kind of has kind of the anti-hero in a way, and the one that comes to mind always is like Tony Soprano or Walter White from Breaking Bad. And so even in these situations where you have an anti-hero, you still are rooting for that person to succeed, that for that hero to win. And so I think that when you're thinking about fiction in general that you're always going to be connected to a character and want to root for someone to see them sort of win. Now, when we're thinking about it in terms of short fiction, this I think becomes really crucial because you have such a limited amount of time. Sometimes only a couple hundred words if we're thinking about something like flash fiction. And so that you really have to get the reader invested in a person, a character that they can kind of root for, so that they can see, this is a worthwhile story, which is something he talks about in number 1. And so this is something like that not only applies to all fiction, but in particular, I think is important when we're thinking about short fiction. Now, number 3, which talks about giving the character something that they want, I think is really interesting and important. Again, not in terms of just fiction, but short fiction, because to me, this relates to conflict, right? So normally, when you give someone something that they want, there has to be some sort of conflict because, for instance, if the character wanted something at the beginning of a story and they immediately just got that something, well, that's not a very compelling story, and also that story would be rather short, right? So if you're thinking about it from that perspective, the conflict of the story really centers around, the person's desire. And I was thinking about this in terms of what we've been reading this week, the Amalia story. I always mispronounce that's the city. When you think about what does this society want? Well, I think like most people or most societies, they want peace and prosperity and things like that, right? But they're willing to, kind of give up a person and chain this person, in the dungeon, so to speak, in order to obtain that peace and prosperity. And so if you think about any story that their characters, all the characters, hopefully, have a desire for something. And when you're thinking about short fiction, I think that becomes even more kind of focused in a way. Because if you're writing short fiction, you really have to distill the conflict down. You're not going to have a lot of time to kind of elaborate on the conflict and kind of reach, going to find what even the conflict is. The conflict has to come really quickly. And so if you think about, short fiction, the central part of what someone wants and the conflict is going to appear much sooner. I'm going to talk about Lord of the Rings next, but if you think about the conflict in that story, if you've read the book, the conflict takes a while to unravel because, it's a sort of takes a long time to get there in a way. Whereas if you're thinking about in a short story, you don't have that time. So I think that when you're looking at short fiction and what characters want, one of the things you might start to notice is that the desires that those characters have in short fiction is going to become not only, I think, more apparent, more clear, but it's going to be more quick in terms of the actual narrative. All right, so that brings us to my third point, where he talks about in number 5, start as close to the end as possible. So this does apply to all fiction. I brought up Lord of the Rings, and this is the same with Game of Thrones. Both of those stories are situated in a larger timeline. So, for instance, if you think about Lord of the Rings, there's thousands of years of history that comes before it, and in a sense, Tolkien does start as close to the end as possible, even though his story is quite long. Game of Thrones is a lot different because, again, thousands of years of history. His story is much broader and bigger scope than Tolkien's, I believe. It spans much more time. However, they do start to the close to the end as possible, I think, in both of these cases, even though they're telling much bigger stories. Now, when you're telling or writing short fiction or just reading short fiction, I think one of the things you'll note is that you're really close to the end, and the scope of the stories is going to be much more focused. So, to kind of bring up Hemingway, because he's another person that we're kind of looking at this week in comparison to Vonnegut. Both when Hemingway and Vonnegut write short fiction, they're very keen in terms of putting you not only in the action right away, but close to the end as possible. So if you've ever read Hills Like White Elephants, basically you're put at possibly, it's obviously not ever stated, but possibly the end of this romantic relationship. And so I think that that's important to think about when you're reading for short fiction is, like, where's the author putting you in terms of the story? How close to the end are they putting you, okay? And by end, we're talking about the sort of resolution. I'm going to talk more about resolutions in the second video this week because that deals with the 2 or 3 types of stories that we're going to be sort of focusing on. Alright, the last thing I just want to talk about is number 8. Give the reader as much information as possible and as soon as possible. To the heck with suspense. Readers should have the complete understanding of what is going on, where and why, that they should finish the story themselves should cockroaches eat the last few pages. And so here, this is kind of, when you're looking at Hemingway this week, and where you are going to be looking at the 6-word short story that he has, Hemingway has this thing called the iceberg theory, where it's sort of like most of the information should be implied, or like the iceberg, you're only seeing a part of the story, and all that stuff underneath is not directly stated. So for instance, when you read the 6-word short story, you get the feeling of this story about these parents or parent losing a child, but you don't know how they lost this child, or how old this child, well, you can kind of gauge how old they were by what the shoes are, but you don't get the sense, like a broad, you don't get an actual concrete sense of what's happening in that story because it's so short, but you feel things, and that's what he would say about the iceberg theory, is like he wanted you to feel more than you knew. So here, I am kind of partial to Hemingway's way of doing things, but I understand what Vonnegut is saying here, and I think that it's actually kind of similar to Hemingway in a way, where I think here what he is saying is that when you're talking about as much information as possible, if you look at all the things that came before this, like we want to know what their desires are, what they want, and that we want to root for them. We want them to have this resolution, and so that you're giving the reader a lot of information. And I don't think what he is saying here is like, oh, they should know the whole character's story. But no, we need to know the sort of the bare bones of the story, the sort of like the desires of this person. And I think that's pretty similar to what Hemingway is operating with the iceberg theory, where he is wanting you to feel things more than you know things. But in the sense, in order to feel something, you have to know something. Like the parents obviously want to have a child, or that's their desire. So in a way, I think that they kind of overlap. We could debate or discuss this in further detail, but I think that if you're looking at number 8 and versus Hemingway, I don't know if they're totally opposed to one another, because I think with Hemingway, he's not saying just withhold information just to withhold information, but withhold the information that you don't need to give. And I think Vonnegut would agree that with number 8 in terms of his list here, I don't think he wants us to kind of do the thing they do in the Bible, where there's just a list, people's fathers and, the son of the son of the son of type thing. I think he wants us to, again, focus on the conflict and the resolution, much like Hemingway, I think, would imagine, I'd say too. All right, so I think that gives us a sense of, fiction and how it relates to short fiction, and how the two are very similar but maybe subtly different. And so if you have any questions, please look at my contact information in the Contact Your Instructor area, and I look forward to talking to you on the boards. And by the way, you might be hearing a newborn in the background, so I apologize for that. All right, talk to you later.